Welcome back to another episode of news that will make you want to change your behavior. First up, we're discussing Gatorade getting sued for their healthy protein bars. Next, be careful where you get your news from because a new study shows it may secretly be McDonald's. And finally, if you are hoping for some nutritional guidance, don't look to the food pyramid because it basically looks like this. First up, PepsiCo faces lawsuit over misleading health claims on Gatorade protein bars. Which of these two products do you think is healthier? I hope you didn't answer this one because I already mentioned lawsuit, Gatorade's getting sued. But if I didn't tell you that, then you probably would have answered this one, and that is why Gatorade is getting sued. PepsiCo can be sued for marketing its Gatorade protein bars as good for you, though they have more sugar than protein and more sugar than typical candy bars, a federal judge ruled. PepsiCo was accused last September of violating federal and state consumer protection laws by creating a health halo around Gatorade bars, including assurances they help muscles rebuild and are used by the pros and are backed by science. Okay, well, let's take a look at this thing. So as we can see, the Gatorade protein bar has this very sporty look for sure. I mean, we've got 20 grams of protein, clearly advertised, whey protein bar. Not a lot going on here. This other packaging here claims to be naturally flavored with other natural flavors. What does that even mean? Naturally flavored with other natural flavors. I actually have no idea what that means. The one I have is really plain, but on other versions of the packaging online, it showed various US sports teams, and it sometimes says Gatorade Recover on the front. Now, to be fair, I wouldn't say it's like doing the most to appear healthy. It does look sporty, but it doesn't scream like healthy to me. But what is surprising is the macros on this thing. 340 calories, 20 grams of protein, 12 grams of fat, and 28 grams of sugar. So if you bought this protein bar without paying attention, you would be buying a protein bar with far more sugar than protein, which is pretty crazy. That's about the same amount of sugar as 6 Oreos and 1 protein bar. So if you just saw the word protein and then thought that that meant you were making a good choice, you would be very wrong. In a decision on Wednesday, U.S. District Judge Casey Pitts in San Jose, California, said 3 self-described fitness enthusiasts leading a proposed class action plausibly alleged that PepsiCo's marketing and labeling was deceptive. The cornerstone of the lawsuit lies in the product's name itself, protein bar, which the court filing says is a naming strategy argued to be deliberately misleading, as it capitalizes on the growing consumer demand for protein-rich health foods without delivering the expected nutritional benefits. The front label, or principal display panel, PDP, prominently displaying 20 grams protein, is another point of contention in the lawsuit. This marketing claim, while true, overshadows the high sugar content, creating a misleading impression of the product's overall health benefits. So the judge ruled that it's plausible that consumers are being tricked into buying these bars so the case can move forward. Meaning that there hasn't been a lawsuit yet, but these guys are free to sue Gatorade if they want to. This is an example of the health halo effect, where we see even just one word we associate with health, like protein, and then our brain goes, I've seen all I need to see here, this is healthy, and I should buy it. And man, this thing has awful ingredients for sure, more sugar than protein, just absolutely jammed full of junk. This is not a health food whatsoever. The idea that it's backed by science is absurd. What exactly is backed by science? Protein? Food in general? This bar in particular is not backed by anything. And yeah, in my opinion, it has to be one of, if not the worst protein bars around. I looked around and I could not see one single protein bar with worse macros in this bar. Maybe someone in the comments can comment if you know a worse protein bar than this, but this is probably the worst one I've seen. For reference, a Quest bar has about 20 grams of protein and 1 gram of sugar, and I would say that's pretty standard for a protein bar. Yet, with all that being said, I think that I am on PepsiCo/Gatorade's side here. PepsiCo called the deception claims implausible because it did not market the bars as healthy or low in sugar, especially for flavors such as chocolate chip and cookies and cream. Pitts, the judge, however, said that reasonable consumers might be unable to readily interpret the sugar content on labels and be misled by PepsiCo's self-proclaimed science-backed claims. Now, on one hand, I absolutely love that we have a judge here that's looking out for the everyday person who might see the word protein and then be like, okay, this is healthy, and then buy and eat this thing under false pretenses. But on the other hand, I mean, first off, the word protein bar doesn't automatically mean healthy. But on the other hand, if we take a step back and look around the grocery store, it is chock full of products pretending to be something that they're not. And I feel like this protein bar is far from the worst offender. It's not even close, okay? You know what one makes me mad? These. Beer paws, veggies, and fruits. We think, oh, this product must be made with love. Maybe you imagine someone like grating some zucchini or some carrots into it. No. This is an ultra-processed food like anything else. They dump the littlest, teeniest, tiniest bit of vegetables and fruits in there, enough to write it on the little ingredients list, and then act like they're selling your kid something that grandma made. For me, that is misleading, that is deceptive, that is wrong. Whenever I see it, it just always makes me mad. Or how about this oatmeal, okay? Absolutely screaming protein on the front, yet it says it contains 5 grams of protein. That is very little protein. You can get the same amount of protein from a serving of plain pasta. Kind of misleading to scream protein on the front just because oats naturally contain a little bit of protein. Or how about this? Kellogg's Pop-Tarts Frosted Strawberry. Good source of 7 vitamins and minerals. Well, yeah, because you guys added in the vitamins and minerals afterwards to cover up the fact that otherwise this is just sugary cardboard being marketed as a breakfast food. All I'm saying is I kind of feel bad for these terrible protein bars in this instance. They were just playing the same game as everyone else, and honestly, not even as aggressively as Pop-Tarts, and yet they get sued. I feel like it's kind of unfair. I don't know. Everywhere you look, corporations are taking advantage of what you don't understand. That's just called marketing. And I feel like if in 2025 we're buying something just because it says protein on the label and then just kind of like closing our eyes afterwards, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment. We need to build our own sense of food literacy because yeah, a protein bar, it doesn't mean it's healthy. I thought that was a funny story and a good reminder that you really cannot trust anything that the food industry puts on the front of the label. In fact, a really good rule of thumb is that usually the healthiest foods at the grocery store make no claims about being healthy at all. Next up, that news story you saw might have been McJournalism, because for some reason, news outlets are producing covert marketing for McDonald's, KFC, and Domino's, study finds. Remember in the past when food companies used to be investigated and questioned by journalists? Well, in 2025, apparently we do the opposite now and run free promos for them instead. Every day we inch just a little bit closer to becoming Wally World. The study, led by the University of Sydney's School of Public Health, analyzed all press releases from McDonald's, KFC, and Domino's Pizza in Australia between July 2021 and June 2022. Findings showed the press releases translated into overwhelmingly positive coverage of the brands. So to put that into layman's terms, in other words, McDonald's comes out with a press release that says, we have a new hamburger. And then the news outlets turn that into a story. And according to this article, not just that, but sometimes these news organizations reprint the press release word for word. They don't even make any changes. They just run the press release as if it was news. And we're not talking about random websites in Australia. Some of the biggest, most visited news sites were doing this. Now, here's why that's problematic. A press release is a written statement from a company that shares their news or updates, but it's really just a sales piece. It's a marketing tool meant to make them look as good as possible, whereas the news, it's meant to be the opposite. It's supposed to fact check and investigate claims. It's supposed to ask the hard questions, not just repeat whatever these companies want us to hear. We assume that we're getting the whole story when we read an article from a trusted news authority. But this study shows that sometimes you're really just being sneakily sold to by McDonald's. And maybe the stakes feel low when we're talking about KFC and McDonald's. Like we're just talking about hamburgers and fried chicken. But to put it into context, okay, imagine the news was just sharing press releases from Boeing, say. Immediately becomes obvious why this could become problematic pretty quickly. If the news is only ever sharing what a company wants us to think about them, then there's a lot that's not going to be discussed. But here's a food-related example of why press releases shouldn't become news. Let's take a look at the press release for McDonald's Big Arch. Also, I feel like people are gonna be like, what the hell are you talking about? This is not a McDonald's hamburger. It's only available in Canada. So the press release says that the Big Arch is McDonald's response to guest desire for a burger that satisfies the extra hungry. And it keeps going on about this being a big burger that's been designed to be satiating. But there are a few issues with this press release. It reads like a heavily photoshopped report card because it's a press release. Its job is to be as flattering as possible to the product. So instead of it being a report on all the things that public might want to know about this hamburger, it's only a positive thing. Okay. Not McDonald's fault, they're just doing their job. But yeah, that leads to things not being mentioned, such as, oh, I don't know, the fact that this hamburger has over 1,000 calories in the burger alone. That's before fries, That's before a drink. Just this hamburger has 1,000 calories. And the strange thing about it is that from what I can tell, it's not even particularly large. These press releases make it seem like it's gigantic, and that makes you think, okay, there's gonna be a lot of beef on this burger. That's the whole thing. It's supposed to be satiating. You're thinking you're gonna get a really big beef patty. Yet, other than the boost in calories, satiation-wise, it actually has the same amount of beef as the quarter pounder, despite being 300 calories more. So where are those calories coming from? And it looks like they just added more sauce and some deep fried onions. That's not gonna make you more full. If you were looking for a more satiating burger, you'd be better off just adding another patty to a normal burger. So the press release all about the satiation thing, like, is it even really telling the truth? When technically it's probably not going to be more satiating. If you test this thing in a lab, is it gonna be more satiating than a quarter pounder? Probably not. So if a news organization just ran the press release for the Big Arch exactly as it was printed, that would be dumb because it would be leaving out some of the most obvious facts about the burger. Facts that McDonald's doesn't mention because it doesn't make sense for them to mention in their press release that's meant to make it look good. They'd rather you not think about that. So when news organizations are running press releases word for word, they're not informing us, they're selling to us. Of 86 articles across 31 Australian news outlets that the researchers identified were generated because of the fast food brand's press releases, they found 80 slanted favorably to the brands. The researchers expressed concern about press release journalism, where reporters presented the preferred narrative of the organizations issuing the press releases. In total, it was found that these news outlets gave 93% positive coverage to these fast food companies. So 80 out of 86 news stories about these companies, some of the biggest and most influential companies in the entire world, by the way, these stories were just advertisements in disguise. If that is not giving Wally World, I do not know what is. And again, the stakes aren't particularly high when we're just talking about sharing pointless news about hamburgers, but it really does make you wonder what else are they rubber stamping if they're just like not even looking at it and printing these stales pitches word for word in the news. Oh, this just in, we just got a preview of the 2025 food pyramid and it looks like this. As you can see, the nation's brightest scientists have ensured that all the major food groups are covered here. Coca-Cola, KFC, Wonder Bread, canola oil, and hot Cheetos are all back for the 45th year in a row, ensuring the lasting good health of the American people. Okay, I kept this story for last because it's a little bit dark and more intense than the other two stories, so buckle up. So the food pyramid itself was actually retired in 2011 and replaced with this image of a plate. But the report that the food pyramid was originally based off lives on. It's still published every 5 years. It's called the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, and the 2025 version is about to be released. This is technically the American government's official recommendations for what to eat and what to avoid between the years 2025 and 2030. So it's like their health guide when it comes to eating. And although the report is not ready yet, it is official that it is not going to touch the ultra-processed foods issue. Why the next dietary guidelines might not tackle ultra-processed foods. So the fact that it's not going to tackle this issue means that Pop-Tarts, Doritos, McDonald's are all getting a free pass health-wise for at least another 5 years, which kind of makes you wonder what the purpose of a report like that even is at that point. Like, the whole point of the report is apparently to help Americans help figure out what to eat to quote unquote promote health and help prevent chronic disease. Yet this report isn't even going to mention ultra-processed foods. It's not going to warn Americans to stay away from them or even recommend they limit them at all, which is kind of crazy because, okay, well, you know what? Let's just go ahead and type ultra-processed foods into Google News and see what we get. Study reveals how ultra-processed foods may fuel bowel cancer. Ultra-processed foods are making us old beyond our years, study warns. Ultra-processed foods may increase fat and weight regardless of exercise. Ultra-processed foods increase active psoriasis risk. Scientists find potential link between ultra-processed foods and cancer. Dude, ultra-processed foods damaging immune system's ability to fight cancer. At this point, this is right now, okay? That's fucking crazy. Obviously, Google News, not the gold standard for science, but this does point to the fact that this is a major health issue right now, backed up by tons of studies that quite literally appear to be emerging every single day. You name the chronic health condition, ultra-processed foods seem to worsen it. So why aren't the dietary guidelines going to address it even a little bit? Just a simple, hey, maybe don't eat so much. Well, according to several articles that came out last week, the reason is there's not enough data. And we'll talk about exactly what that means in a minute. But while I was looking around, I found this article from earlier in the year that suggests that this is not the entire story. And there's a lot more going on behind the scenes than just not enough data. Get ready, this story's kind of a lot. Is America's ultra-processed diet that bad? Big Food fights back. Food industry rallies to defend processing. Changes could rock the world of manufacturers. So this news article came out last January as federal researchers began poking into ultra-processed foods, preparing to make their conclusions for the Dietary Guidelines report. And this whole idea of like ultra-processed foods are unhealthy, this thing that's been going on in the media and science lately has been massively threatening their profit margins, and this article kind of outlines a little bit what it would do. And the article also describes how behind the scenes they've been fighting back. The article actually goes in detail into the steps that Big Food's been taking in order to prevent the guidelines for making a recommendation against ultra-processed food, aka now what we know happened. Makers of food from ice cream to pasta sauce are stepping up lobbying and pushing back as the US government probes the health effects of heavily processed food. It is a new front in a struggle that could reshape America's approach to nutrition and threaten profits for companies behind foods throughout much of the supermarket. In other words, most products on the shelves are ultra-processed foods. It's not one or two items or this line of macaroni and cheese, it's 90% of the portfolio and counting. So there's a lot at stake here for these food companies dollar-wise. Cheetos alone, just Cheetos, that is $1 billion brand. Just Cheetos. These guys don't want anything to jeopardize that. And this past year, the government's team of scientists have been poking around, investigating ultra-processed foods, going through the data, evaluating the health risks, and trying to determine whether or not they are going to declare them unhealthy on this 2025 report. And the thing is, if UPFs were officially declared unhealthy, it would reshape the way Americans eat and force the food industry to reinvent everything. Greater attention to processing marks a major new challenge for food makers. U.S. dietary advice for decades has focused largely on individual nutrients, such as sugar, salt, or saturated fat. By contrast, concerns over processing strike at the heart of how most packaged food is produced. It's going to rock the world for the food industry, said Dr. Dariush Mozaffarian, a cardiologist and professor of nutrition at medicine at Tufts University. That's never been a standard to which they've been held before. If the 2025 Dietary Guidelines called out ultra-processed foods, the food industry would be kind of screwed. They would have to change everything about the way that they make food. Because in the past, when something about a food was officially declared unhealthy, bad, it changed the world. For example, the Dietary Guidelines of the 1980s singled out dietary fat. That changed what Americans ate for decades. The guidelines recommended reducing dietary fat, and as a result, people became very anti-fat. Everyone was afraid of eating fats. We thought they were going to give us heart disease. The idea was fat made you fat, and every person was avoiding fat at the grocery store like a plague. So what happened to the food industry in this scenario? Well, nothing bad. It was actually kind of a boon for them. Suddenly, every item in the grocery store was fat-free or low fat. We had that whole fat-free craze that lasted like 20 years. All the food industry had to do in that scenario was reformulate their products, which they were basically able to do overnight. So they stripped out all the fat and then they just pumped sugar in to take its place. People still enjoyed their products. They still got to make money. They were happy. All the food industry had to do was reformulate their products, which they were able to do overnight. They stripped out all the fat and pumped in sugar to take its place, which is now widely considered to be a disastrous health move. So now imagine if today the government labeled ultra-processed foods bad instead of dietary fat. Where would that leave them? They can't just do a simple swap like that. They'd have to start from scratch. It would be a nightmare for them financially. So is it any surprise that these companies have been fighting tooth and nail to stop this from happening? And so here is, according to this article, exactly what they've been doing to stop this from behind the scenes. And it was written in the Wall Street Journal, it was out there for all to see. Tell me if you think this is appropriate, okay? Big food companies are marshaling a defense, with some seeking to forestall recommendations in the coming dietary guidelines. Translation, they tried to have ultra-processed foods left out of the 2025 dietary guidelines. It's literally printed right there. They were working to prevent it from happening, and now we know they succeeded. And again, There's the data thing there. It's not just like 100% corruption. It's just that they have a lot of influence over what happens. Next, behind the scenes, they've also been pressing for more oversight of government-funded research on ultra-processed foods. Isn't that insane? The food industry is pushing to have more control over how the government studies ultra-processed foods. Isn't that absurd? In what world should the food industry have any oversight at all into publicly funded science? The fact that they feel entitled to this is absolutely deranged. And then the final thing, okay? Last summer, more than a dozen food, beverage, and commodity groups called for an advisory committee that informs the Dietary Guidelines to consult food scientists on ultra-processed foods. They also aired concerns about the research the committee could consider, cautioning it against making strong recommendations on the foods. Okay, sifting through all the jargon here, I had to read that like 3 times. Last summer, different companies within Big Food got together and were essentially lobbying the government to allow them to put together a committee of scientists likely aligned with their interests to play a role in shaping the guidelines. So they tried to put together their little group of people to make sure that they had their say. They wanted to ensure that the 2025 Dietary Guidelines included the opinions of their scientists, their preferred scientists. And they also tried to influence which studies would be able to be considered viable research. They also aired concerns about some of the research, so they looked at the studies, they chose the ones that they thought painted them in a bad light, likely, and then picked them apart and tried to find reasons that they shouldn't be included in the guidelines. So all of those events happened in addition to who knows how many dollars worth of lobbying efforts. All of that went into preventing the 2025 Dietary Guidelines from saying that UPFs are unhealthy. But yeah, after all that, is it really a surprise that this is the conclusion that they came to? But yeah, kind of seems like the food industry just got their way on this one. Now, I'm sure there's a lot more to it than that. It's not just the food industry corrupting this whole process. There are actually some issues with the definition ultra-processed food. It's too vague. It needs to be kind of like broken down more. But I think this is pretty good insight into just how influential they are over your health, which is kind of problematic considering how much they lie. So is it really any wonder that in the end, the Dietary Guidelines Committee ultimately came to the conclusion that, quote unquote, there's not enough evidence to recommend avoiding ultra-processed foods. Anyway, simple conclusion from today's stories: you can't trust ultra-processed food. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.